Welcome everybody. I'd like to call to order the work session on AO 2015-63. It's an ordinance repealing AO 2014-28 in its entirety and reinstating the first Tuesday in April as the annual time for regular municipal elections in accord in Anchorage Municipal Code Section 2820.01. Can we start with introductions, please?
You can call me, I'm going to represent myself.
Patrick Flynn. Bill Evans.
Elby Gray Jackson.
Tim Stew.
Amy Bosky.
Pete Peterson.
Ernie Hall.
And folks in the audience, please introduce yourself.
Jackie Yeagle, Clerk Clerk's Office.
Please introduce yourselves.
Barbara Jones, Municipal Clerk. Julia Tucker, Assembly Council.
Rosella Young, Legal Assistant.
Jackie Slater with KTVA. Emily Landy with KTVA.
Hello, and then,
Amanda Moser, Clerk's Office.
okay, Amanda, you have the floor.
Thank you. First, before we get started, I just want to thank the Assembly for the opportunity to talk about the potential logistical challenges that we would have with the municipal election being in November. AO 2014-28 was passed February 25th, 2014, and that moved the municipal elections to November to be at the same time as the state and federal election. Since we've begun exploring the strategies for moving the election to November, we've encountered some potential challenges that might come up, and so I just want to take some time to talk about those. One thing it's really important to recognize before I start talking that although our election would be at the same time as the state and federal election, which is run by the State of Alaska Division of Elections, it would be a separate election. So we would be running a concurrent election. And one of the reasons that we would have a separate election is that the State of Alaska Division of Elections has precincts, and each precinct has one ballot style. Within the municipality of Anchorage, we don't have that luxury. We have some split precincts across the Anchorage Bowl area, and splits are caused when there is multiple ballot styles within a precinct. Multiple ballot styles within a precinct are caused by a couple different things. Within the municipality of Anchorage, we do have one split precinct that's caused by an assembly section being split between two precincts. That's precinct 520, and that's split between the downtown assembly section and the midtown assembly section. And then throughout the rest of Anchorage, we have splits that are caused mostly by service areas. And those service areas include the limited road service areas, along with our fire, police, park, and road service areas. Anchorage Municipal Code requires any bond that's put before the body or put before the voters to be voted on both by people who live within that service area and by people who live outside the service area. And so in order for any bond to pass, it has to be approved by people who are going to be paying that extra bond, but then also every other person who lives within the municipality of Anchorage, because everything's based on the full faith and credit of the municipality. So a lot of ballots will look exactly the same. They'll have, both the park bond are listed on both ballots, but one ballot is going to be counted for voters who live within that park service area, and the other ballot is going to be voted on by folks who live outside the park service area, so we can make sure that it is approved by both sets of voters. So that is one of the challenges that is associated with municipal elections. Some of our split precincts just have one or two ballot styles, but we have this one split precinct in South Anchorage that has 13 different ballot styles. So that is an additional complications with having all those different ballot styles in one precinct. We've worked really hard over the past 5 years to make it as easy as possible for our election workers to be able to identify which ballot a voter should get. This is one thing that I'm really proud of with my work with the elections. In 2010, it's the first time I'd ever worked in elections, and we recognized really quickly how challenging these precincts were, and we had more split precincts back then before redistricting because we had a lot of assembly split precincts. And we used to just have black and white maps that were labeled with numbers that corresponded to a small little number on the ballot. And since then, we've really improved our system where we now have color-coded maps that match the color-coded ballots. So it's really easy for a voter to be able to go in and identify the area of town that they live on. It's color-coded, that's specific to a ballot that's also color-coded. We've even worked a little bit beyond that, and we've created a split precinct register that actually identifies where the voters should be within those areas, but there's still a few kinks that we're working out. So that is part of the challenges of our election. So it's not specifically possible to just put our issues on the state's ballot, which is one of the reasons why we'd have the concurrent elections. So the challenges associated with the concurrent elections, first and foremost, is going to be the election workers. We have 122 precincts within the municipality of Anchorage. We hire over 600 election workers. And we looked at the numbers this past year, and out of those 600 election workers, over 500 of them work for both the state and the municipality. So we are, as it is, sharing a large percentage of our election workers with the State of Alaska Division of Elections. Every year, and it's gotten more challenging in the recent years, it is a struggle to staff the precincts. It's hard to find people who are willing to work one day a year, come into training and do a very technical, specialized job with a lot of pressure throughout the day. So we do have challenges finding our election workers. We're thankful that we're able to use the state's workers, but in order to find additional workers to have the concurrent election, I think it would be incredibly challenging. And one thing that I will say about our election workers is I'm really grateful for our long-term election workers. I think that they help us out every year, but it's especially important to have those long-term experienced election workers when we have challenges with our elections. And I will say 2012, if it wasn't for our long-term election workers who came up with solutions to some of the challenges of running out of ballots across Anchorage, we might be in a little bit more of a hurt situation after that. But we had election workers that were able to photocopy ballots so that they could use them. They knew to use sample ballots. They were able to react, and it was because they've been working elections for years and decades. So beyond the workers, one of the other challenges is the polling locations. We share all of our 100 polling locations with the State of Alaska Division of Elections. We use schools, churches, athletic clubs throughout the municipality for our polling locations. And some of these, we don't have a ton of space. I try and travel around, especially during the state's elections, to look at the different locations and how they function. And a lot of times, people are voting in the front hallway as you come into school, and there's not a lot of room. So I think there would be some challenges with having 2 precincts set up within one polling location. I think it's important to talk about that we would need 2 separate precincts set up because voters would need to come in and sign the state's register, be issued a ballot for the state election, vote that ballot, and then they would need to come to the municipality, sign the register for the municipality of Anchorage, be issued the ballot, and then vote that ballot. One thing as we're looking at elections, it's really important that we are able to track who's being issued a ballot, who's voting, and that's why we need those precinct registers. So we would need to have 2 separate tables set up in some of these small locations. One of the third major challenges is going to be equipment. We use the state's equipment, and I would recognize that we would most likely be able to share the voting booths. But we would need to have a discussion about how we would want to process ballots on election night. And this is kind of one of those choose your own adventure books. I used to read those a lot when I was a kid. So adventure number 1 would be we would continue to share the state's equipment, which is what we do currently. And because the state is using, and I'm specifically talking about the AccuVote machines and the ballot boxes, The state would be using it already for their election, and with that system, you're not able to have a AccuVote machine scan two separate ballots from two separate elections. So if we chose not to purchase our own equipment, then the state would have their memory card in the AccuVote machine, and it would be scanning their ballots throughout the day. The municipality would have to have a secure location where voters would be able to put their ballots into, and they would be held in that secure location throughout the day. And then I think potentially at the end of the day, once the state workers complete their end of the night procedures, then the municipality of Anchorage election workers would be able to scan the ballots through the AccuVote machine that have been stored in the secure location throughout the day. I think that there's other challenges that come up with that. One thing that's really nice with the AccuVote machines is that people are able to get a count of how many people have voted throughout the day and see that their ballot has scanned through the machine. If you're just putting the ballots in a secure location, you wouldn't really have a good sense of that. So that's the measure number one. We would choose to have the state's equipment and just borrow it at the end of the night. I think one of the other challenges associated with that is our election workers get to the polls at 6 a.m. The polls close at 8 p.m. The end of the procedures usually take between 45 minutes to an hour. So they're probably not going to be able to start scanning ballots until about 9 o'clock at night, which is going to impact the time that they get back here to City Hall, and it's also going to impact the time that our election results are shared with the public. So, but if we chose to purchase our own AccuVote machines, we could do that. We could have our separate AccuVote machines. I think we would need to determine where we would store them. We have some challenges with space here at City Hall as it is, and one thing that is an advantage of using the state's equipment is we borrow it for a couple months around election time, and then we return it at the end of the time. And this room is the perfect example. We use this room to store that equipment during the election, but we're able to have it set back up as a conference room the rest of the time. We would have to think about where we are going to store that. One of the other challenges would be if you have two separate elections in the same location, if a voter came in to vote a question ballot, they would have to vote a question ballot, which requires additional paperwork for the state, and they would have to vote a question ballot for the city. One concern that might come up with that is, what if a ballot from the municipal elections inadvertently put in the state's question ballot envelope, or vice versa? Those aren't processed right away, and it might be challenging to afterwards switch the ballots back over. Just a few other those are my three big concerns: workers, the polling locations, and the equipment. I think there's other smaller concerns, and a lot of things we recognized this past year when we had the item on the ballot for the state's election. We would really have to make sure that we worked with the state to have our voter pamphlets go out at the same time. I think we could be concerned about voter fatigue. It would be a voter would have to go in and go through two separate processes. And as I'm talking about all these things, I really want to be clear. I have worked really hard for the last couple of years to increase voter turnout. That has been one of my goals when I was offered this position, was how do we engage more people within the municipality of Anchorage, within the municipal election process. And this is something that I am really passionate about. I'm really proud of the work that we've done, the clerk's office, over the past couple of years. We have increased voter turnout. But I am concerned about the potential logistical challenges with having our election at the same time as the state. I think that there is some challenges that come with that. So,
Thank you.
oh, one last thing. The state only has elections on the even number of years, and I think that that could impact our elections and the administration of our elections between odd and even years as how we handle voter turnout and the election workers and stuff like that too. Important to think about.
Thank you for your presentation, Mrs. Lynn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Amanda, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're leaving town next week, so for those of you who are wondering why we're doing this a week ahead of normal, it's to make sure we have our subject matter expert here. If we were to purchase our own scanners, what's the rough capital cost associated there too?
I can get back to you on that number. We have some numbers from the equipment that we currently have, or that we currently use, but it's not new equipment. So I have to get back to you on what that would cost for.
Okay, well, and I appreciate you getting back to me. Just sort of in general precedence, first general numbers, we're talking about $500,000, $1 million, $2 million. Do you have a rough order of magnitude, or do you just need to?
It's probably best if I get back
Okay.
a more accurate
All right,
number.
I'm not gonna try and pin you down.
I know we looked into it
I remember that. I just don't remember what the
back
what
when
happened.
we
And
did. Barbara might have it.
There was a scene that was provided with the original ordinance. I'm not sure if it's attached to this one.
so it's not up here. So. And I think I heard you say you anticipate that the scanning process takes 45 minutes to an hour at the end of the day. Well, no, you said that associated with state elections. If we're holding all the ballots, waiting to use the scanners that the state has, how much time would it then take to scan and tabulate those ballots, or do you have?
Yeah, excellent question through the chair. I said that it typically takes about 45 minutes for an hour for election workers to do the end of the night procedures, which includes closing down the ActiVote machine and removing all the ballots out of the black ballot box. So polls closing at 8, imagining that that takes an hour. At 9 o'clock, our election officials are going to be able to start running ballots, and the process of running ballots goes pretty quickly, but I imagine it would take another hour or so. One other thing to consider is when a voter puts their ballot into the AccuVote machine as they're voting, if there's any overvoted races, so if a voter inadvertently voted for 2 candidates or yes and no on a proposition, the AccuVote machine spits that back out and the voter is able to correct their vote. We wouldn't have that happen and voters would have already left, so we would be impacted by more ballots that had not scanned and would have to come back to our office for review. But I imagine that would take, about 45 minutes to scan the ballots, and then our workers would also have to do the closing polls procedures.
So we're looking at 90 to 120 minutes of additional time after roughly 9 p.m. at night. Okay. And I'm sorry, Madam Chair, is it okay if I continue?
Certainly, thank you, Mrs. Lynn.
Specific to the Division of Elections, sort of, it's a two-part question. One is, what is their process once they close out their machine? Does the chip then get taken to their headquarters and that would be then delayed because we're doing our piece, or is there a way of subbing out the chip or whatever it is, the information transference medium that would allow them to at least continue with their process while we do ours?
Excellent question. Through the chair, the State of Alaska Division of Elections, it's a memory card, and they will have the memory cards loaded into the AccuVote machines. And once they do their closing polls procedures, which does include attempting to upload results by using a fax line. Then after that, they remove the memory card from the AccuVote machine and take it with their supplies back to the state. At that point, our workers would then be able to insert our memory cards into the AccuVote machine and begin scanning our ballots.
Okay, so at the very least, we're not postponing the state process.
No.
Okay. And then, final thing is, when we discussed this several years ago, the Division of Elections expressed a series of concerns with the confluence of state municipal elections. What progress, if any, has been made in that conversation with the Division of Elections?
As far as,
Whether they can accommodate this if we don't pass this legislation,
yeah.
what steps have they taken to help you help us get this right?
Through the chair, we have, we had a meeting scheduled with the state for back in June. It got canceled due to conflicts, and we're still working on scheduling another meeting with them to talk about just some election issues in general, and I think this will be on the agenda also.
So in other words, the concerns that you enumerated in your presentation have yet to be resolved.
That's correct.
That's all I had, Madam Chair. Thank you.
You're welcome, Mr. Evans.
Yeah, just a couple quick questions. One, I have to rely on my more senior colleagues on the history of this. Which wasn't too long ago, but before my time, you changed the law to make this go to November. Were these issues discussed? Were there any work sessions?
Yes. Yes.
What was the thought behind how these would be resolved?
Arnie is probably the best authority to answer that question, I would say.
That'd be fine, whoever.
Mr. Hall.
To be honest with you, Mr. Evans, yes, there was a work session, but there wasn't a lot of in-depth discussion about this. The whole point, the whole thrust of it was, we just want to get a larger turnout. So at the end of the day, it was an issue in regards to being able to get voters to go vote. And I will expand on that a little bit. I'm going to follow you, so.
The only thing I would add to that is I believe that the letter that we received from the Division of Elections at that time is attached to the material that was associated with,
It's attached to the AO from 2014.
Yeah, so that sort of enumerates some of the things that Amanda was discussing, so I'll proceed.
Mr. Evans, would you like to continue?
Yeah, just
Before you do, I'll just let everybody know, I know we're running a little bit over, but that's okay, because we started a little bit late, and there's no rules that says we can't. So, Mr. Evans.
Just two real quick. Do you know, are there any locations in Alaska that run concurrent elections with the state, current?
Denali Borough, I believe. I think smaller jurisdictions, not
Well, that'll have to be, yeah.
not anything with 122 precincts and 600 election workers.
If I can help you, Mr. Evans, if I may, Madam Chair. In my youth, municipal elections were held in October, and that is the common practice throughout Alaska. They sort of were sandwiched between the primary in August and the general in November. And as part of my deep, dark history, which I try not to confess, but I'll do it today, I worked on the No on 4 campaign, whatever year that was. The tax cap initiative that we capped was sort of Prop 8 California import. And when we did our polling, and Mr. Hall and I were both involved in that, when we did our polling, we found a problem in Fairbanks. We were winning everywhere in the state, and we were getting our rear ends kicked in Fairbanks, and we couldn't figure out why. Until we realized that Fairbanks had a tax cap similar to Anchorage's, but that it required a decennial renewal, and it was on the ballot that year. And so they were in favor of it right until they got past that election in October, and then all of a sudden the polls flipped overnight. And they, like the rest of the state, supported killing the initiative. So it's one of the challenges of confluence of municipal and state elections.
Through my experience with the Alaska Association of Municipal Clerks, I can tell you that most of them have their elections in October. The major Matsu Borough, Wasilla, Palmer.
Thank you, Ms. Moser. Mr.
Oh,
Cole,
Can I
will
just
you-
have one last
Oh, you're not finished?
question?
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
sorry. Just with, the ability of technology to solve some problems, are there any AccuView or similar type machines that are now on the market or contemplated that would actually have the capacity to have 2 memory chips in them? So that you can have, I don't know, if that's anything real.
Not to my knowledge, through the chair, I've discussed this with our representative through the company, and not anything that I am aware of, because it's, on the back end, the memory card is pulling from a database that's created, and so you would have to, and that's maybe where the breakdown of having the 2 separate databases on one memory card. And then that might also, through this year, provide additional challenges with, as far as results getting,
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Evans and Ms. Moser. Mr. Hope, did you finish your comments? Or would you like to-
Yes, I do. I'm going to try to cover a lot really quickly so I can stay within the 30-minute work session.
Well, we're already past that, so, no, yeah.
There's several things that we need to recognize here. One, we keep talking about voter fatigue. I think that's going to be a minor issue compared to voter confusion. When they go in there and they're going to 2 different deals, they're getting different ballots, honestly, it'll be chaos. Part of the reason that it was taken fairly lightly before, and I'm not saying this in a negative way at all, please understand that, but the former lieutenant governor just basically made it clear this isn't a problem. We can handle this, won't be an issue. And I'm not sure that he really grasped the fact that they were not going to be managing our election. We were going to be doing 2 elections concurrently, and there was no way around that. When you talked with staff, they were sitting there just going, oh my God, type of deal. So another thing too is let's be clear, if we don't change this and we do vote, we're really not going to have an option. Whatever it costs, we're going to have to buy the AccuVote equipment to be able to do an election. You're not going to be able to stick these in a box someplace and wait, because the state owns the equipment. If they have an issue during that election, we're going to get it when they're done with it. So I think we're maybe being a little over-optimistic about being able to access or AccuVote equipment by 8 or 9 o'clock that evening. My guess is reality is going to be closer to midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. I mean, they upload theirs, they don't necessarily deliver it, but it never runs really smoothly. And the decision we're going to need to make is, we are looking, as a matter of fact, you're probably going to see a resolution coming from the Elections and Ethics Committee here really soon about going to a mail-in election this next year in 2016. So the decision is, where do we spend our money? I mean, if we do that, then we're going to have to buy equipment to do a by mail. Mail voting is changing all across the country. They're moving to mail-in, or they're actually doing online. I think going to the polls before too far in the future is going to be one of those fond memories that we have. We remember when we used to go vote. Of course, even then, on a voting day, there's going to be an opportunity for those that still want to do that to go to a poll and vote. There's not going to be 122 places to go do it. So that is kind of the whole crux of what we're dealing here. And by the way, Mr. Flynn, I don't remember the exact cost, but it's a lot. It's not cheap. And we will be coming forward with that recommendation to go to a mail-in. But I'm going to tell you, I'm going to go back to confusion. And that would be that when and if we do go to a mail-in, even if we said, okay, we'll be okay doing that in November with the general election, you will really have confusion at that point in time, because the city may be doing a mail-in, the state's doing go to the polls and vote, and you got a lot of people that have mailed their ballot in, assume they've taken care. the confusion, it's not going to be fatigue, confusion, in my opinion, is going to be the really big word. Thank you, Madam
Thank
Chair.
you, Mr. Ball. Mr. Bosky?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my recollection's just a little different. I remember talking last time about split precincts, about the issue with sharing workers, and about the machines. We talked about all of this. And we realized that there would be a couple of years for them to work it out to see if they could work it out. That was the discussion. If anybody corrects me, I'll be willing to discuss it, but that's it. When we talk about the Matsu Borough and those others, their voter turnout in October is about 10 or 11% in between the primary and that. And actually, I know many legislators right now in those precincts or in those areas of town, of the state, they're looking to change their municipal elections to November. And I know there's a petition right now in the Valley to do so. So even though they're in October, I know there's challenges with those too. I've always been an advocate of turning out voter turnout. I don't understand why we can't work with the state of Alaska the same way we all apply with our PFDs, vote online. I mean, it's secure. There should be ways we could do that. And I'm sure it's probably precluded somehow in state law or maybe even the Constitution, but it seems to me the easiest way to do everybody at the same time would to have some sort of memorandum of understanding with the state and let us, as a municipality, because we have so many split precincts, actually run their election. But I think that would probably take a change in state law to do that. But to me, it makes more sense. I mean, we have 122 precincts, and the state doesn't have nearly that many in the municipality of Anchorage. So the logical thing would be for us to run their election and add their people to our ballot. Makes sense. But that would take a real, now see everybody's shaking their heads there because that makes sense, right? Because ours are more complicated than theirs, it'd just be easier, but it would take cooperation on the state's part to let us do that. But beyond that, the other thing that nobody's discussing, and I sat in the Board of Ethics meeting yesterday, and I know the chair ran downstairs during that meeting to discuss with the Ethics and Election Committee. I think that's the big elephant in the room that a lot of assembly members aren't aware of. Ernie, do you want to talk about it, or do you want me just to pass on?
No, I'm willing to discuss it if the chair's willing to let the meeting run a little longer.
I am more than happy to let the meeting run a little bit longer, and I apologize to Zig and others that we're running a little over, but this is a really, really important subject that I think we need to.
So let me just, if I'll just set it up for you maybe. So yesterday I sat in the Board of Ethics Committee meeting, and initially when Mr. Birch brought this forward, there was a big discussion about every assembly member basically had a conflict because it could impact your term, right? So this was set out for 2017 in which it was passed everyone's term. During the Ethics and Election Committee, or Election Ethics Committee meeting yesterday, it was very clear that the Ethics Committee, or Commission, I'm saying it wrong, Ethics Board, thank you. The Board of Ethics did take exception to both Ms. Tucker's analysis and someone else's, was it Dennis's, I'm not sure. But they felt like assembly members who truncated their terms, it was still a conflict. It's the exact same conflict that Chris had in introducing it. So that means Mr. Flynn, Mr. Evans, Ms. Gray Jackson, Mr. Steele, and Mr. Peterson, by taking action, the members in 2017, that your terms don't expire till then, every one of you would be violating the ethics rules. In their opinion now, with that said, I brought up in the state law, or in the state, there's something called the rule of necessity. Essentially saying, if everybody has a conflict, nobody has a conflict, right? Deannis, said basically it's nowhere specifically in municipal code. However, Ms. Jones indicated that with other issues, the city has argued the rule of necessity and won. So there's this little bit of conflict here in that the same reason we pushed it out to 2017 to avoid that ethics conflict for every assembly member would apply to those members in 2017 that are truncating or potentially truncating their terms. So, that's an issue. Now, the members in 2016, myself, Mr. Hall, would be fine to take action on it because obviously we're not truncating your terms because you're up for re-election. However, there's only 5 of us, so then you wouldn't have quorum. So, I think honestly, the easiest thing, and I did bring it up, and I kind of winked at Barbara when I did it. One of the things I'm planning on bringing forward, because whether we're talking about elections specifically, or whether we're talking about assembly pay, or whether you're talking about anything to do with assembly members and assembly terms, you're here to represent the public. So I believe the public servants can put the public interest before themselves, so they have a responsibility to take action on items that the public wants you to take items on. And it's ridiculous to say everybody has a conflict and nobody can make a decision. So I will be bringing forward a tweak to municipal code to basically insert the language the state has for the rule of necessity, so that I think people will be able to make decisions on items like this without worrying about potential recall or violating any ethical standards. So that's my assessment, that as the way I heard it yesterday. It's this weird little catch-22, but the way the discussion that was had around the Board of Ethics yesterday was essentially, even if you repeal this, you would have to repeal it with an effective date of 2018.
Thank you, Mr. Bosky. Ms. Jones has a comment, and then I'll go to you, Mr. Pearson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just like to set up the context of the Board of Ethics meeting. And so first of all, the context was that the Deputy Municipal Attorney asked when this item was introduced if it was a conflict. At that time, several comments were made that, well, it's just the opposite of the prior Board of Ethics opinion. This is not extending terms, it's truncating them. The Assembly should be allowed to rely on a prior Board of Ethics opinion instead of having to request an opinion every time they take action, which is what Ms. Demboski is trying to resolve. At a subsequent board, or it was the Ethics and Elections Committee meeting, Ms. Ennis brought it up again. And at that time, Mr. Hall asked her to get an informal opinion from the Board of Ethics. I followed up with her a couple of times to see if that could happen, and it wasn't on the agenda for the meeting. And I reminded them that Mr. Hall's committee was meeting at the same time, and they needed to take this up at 11:30. So they did take it up at 11:30, but although the board had the discussion that Ms. Demboski described, it was based on a draft memo that the Deputy Municipal Attorney had drafted, stating that, in fact, it was a potential conflict. And my take on it, there was some discussion later, one of the members said, well, isn't the Assembly's duty to disclose the conflict, and then the chair rules, and then the Assembly votes whether or not it's a conflict. So there was some discussion that it's up to the Assembly whether it's a conflict or not. The other issue that I'll let you know, and I think this part of the discussion may fall away based on how the discussion went, it's a conflict to extend your term. It's not a conflict to truncate your term, but the discussion was that it's a conflict to vote no on Mr. Flynn's ordinance because that would in effect be extending your term. Well, it's not. That is saying that the status quo, you are maintaining the status quo. So I think there's somewhat of a problem, and I think Ms. Tucker is up on this. She's up on this issue, that there would be a conflict depending on how you voted on an issue before you. And so at the meeting, the issue of the potential conflict of interest came up. And Mr. Hall, Ms. Tucker, and I, and Ms. Moser met after the Ethics and Elections Committee meeting and decided that it was appropriate to proceed with this work session, that we thought that the Board of Ethics basically said they did not want to do an informal opinion, they want to do a more formal opinion. Mr. Hall gave them the time to do that. They're supposed to have it back to Mr. Hall before.
I think we ended up, it's probably going to be the last meeting
In July.
In
July 28th.
Right.
So that is to some degree where we are procedurally. So the issue was that I don't think there's anything, even though this debate happened yesterday, because it was just a debate that's in the context of a draft that isn't shared with you, I don't think that we can make any decisions yet whether or not there's a conflict, and ultimately the conflict is up to you.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. I'm gonna, if you don't mind, Mr. Peterson, allow Mr. Bosco to speak before you because of the conversation that's going on. Thank you.
Ladies first.
Thank you, Mr. Bosco.
So I agree 99% of what Barbara just said. I seem to recall there were some members that could have potentially, let me be very clear, the Board of Ethics officer disagreed with Assembly Council. So they had a disagreement because there were some that believed by diminishing your term it could still be a conflict. And so you know, you look at it and say, well, you don't get paid as much or whatever. I don't remember exactly the rationale they used, but some felt like any changing to your term could potentially be a conflict. That's kind of how I took it. But they were very clear. And so to me, the easiest solution to keep everybody transparent, open, and within the spirit of the law is whether we don't specifically see it in code, yet we've relied on it before in the past for other issues. I think the rule of necessity, I think as public servants, we have a duty to make decisions. You know, just like last week or this week I had to vote on a cell tower, right? I was able to put the public interest before myself. I believe each one of us has that ability. And I believe sometimes there are things where, quite frankly, you know, when we're talking about the chair ruling, the chair can't rule if everybody has a conflict, because so does he. So that was part of the discussion too. Well, you know, if the chair decides he has a conflict, who decides on the chair's conflict? The body, right? Well, the body all has a conflict, so then nobody can decide. And this is the dog chasing the tail that they were discussing. They're like, this doesn't make any sense. And so to me, it's just easiest to clarify code to make sure that public servants can do their job when in fact each one of us might have some sort of arm length or even closer thing, but it's in the public interest for us to be able to make decisions. So that's why I say what I say, and you know, my personal recommendation is this discussion is going to happen. I already can count noses, I already know how it's going, but my goal is to make sure we have a clear and transparent public process that keeps everybody out of, because I guarantee there will be ethics complaints lodged, and from the discussion I heard yesterday at the Board of Ethics committee, or I keep saying it wrong, at the Board of Ethics meeting, my assumption was those will hold unless there is a precursory clarification in code that members have a duty to serve the public first and foremost.
Thank you, Mr. Glasgow. I think Ms. Tucker wanted to respond also. Mr. Peterson, I will go to you. Thank you for your patience.
So I attended the meeting of the Bernie's election and ethics committee yesterday, and that was the first that I recognized that this situation was going on and on and on in the Board of Ethics. And so the comments that that I share here in summary are these. There is already state law applicable to the municipality in Title 29, Chapter 45, that allows the Assembly to waive even a conflict where they find that there is substantial financial interest. So that's already, the Assembly is already allowed to do that. The governing body is allowed to do that. The situation with the Ethics Board is they can give informal advice if they think that you're going off, but somebody needs to formally request an advisory opinion of the board for them to be able to do an advisory opinion. So I don't know the status of that communication. The meeting that I participated in with Mr. Hall, when his committee first met, I understood that only a informal reading was given, and the purpose of that, in my view, was to determine whether the assembly needed to add something to the ordinance to make that clear. And so, and by the ordinance, I mean Mr. Flynn's ordinance. So the repeal ordinance is repealing 2014-28, and that has a recital clause talking about this ethics opinion in it. And so one avenue that the Assembly may want to do about this ordinance, instead of the global view of the rule of necessity and how in or out of the Assembly and the Assembly's actions the Ethics Board is going to be, my understanding from Mr. Flynn was that all of 28 was going to be repealed, and so there could be a new section 3 to the ordinance that would just do the notwithstanding, because you're repealing, and that repeal has a reference, and so it would say that something to the effect that the Anchorage Assembly acknowledges the recital clause is incorporated in 2014-28, and notwithstanding this board advisory opinion, which isn't given by number, but it has a number now, generally referenced in the first recital, the Anchorage Assembly finds there is no conflict of interest by any current Assembly member upon participation in action on this ordinance. This finding applies irrespective of whether the Assembly member votes for or against this ordinance and irrespective of the term of office. Because this web of the going around and around like that was brought up when the Assembly first passed this code by the Ethics Board then. And they said, we object to this because it means that you could all get together and all have a conflict, and you could all vote to waive your conflict. And the Assembly said, yes, we can, because that's what the state law allows us to do. It allows us as a body to waive even a substantial financial interest conflict. And so yes, and we do it publicly, and the remedy for the public, if they don't like the way we're voting and they think that we are voting a conflict, then they cannot elect us the next time. But the Board of Ethics does not sit above the governing body, and you do not have to run and get the Board of Ethics opinion every time you go to do something. And to me, it's ludicrous that you can't undo something that you did. You can't have just a little tiny window to do it, and then, oh, it's gone, it's there forever. Now, suddenly the Assembly's ability to manage elections is gone.
And Ms. Tucker, on that note, I'm going to cut you off. Thank you for your comments. We have like about 6 minutes left, because I'm going to go to 1, and then we can talk about another work session. But Mr. Peterson, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I got to tell you, the weeds are getting pretty deep. And I actually agree with Julia, Assembly Council, 100% on that. And I was just going to mention one additional problem that I see with voter confusion that Mr. Hall brought up earlier. It's not uncommon for there to be several initiatives on the ballot. And so you have a state initiative, number 1, you have a local number 1, number 2, number 3, and you got advertising going out about number 1, number 2, number 3, and their eyes are going to glaze over, and I just think we're expecting too much from the voters to figure this all out. That's just my opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Steele?
Yes, I'll make it quick. On that particular item, it's going to be counterproductive to actually have an election with the state. It's going to cause more confusion. It's going to disillusion some of the electorate, and maybe years before you get them back to the polls. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why it's not a good thing to do. The election workers and the costs and so on and so forth, certainly is a part of that. In terms of the conflict of interest issue, we all have a marginal conflict of interest in everything we do because we're citizens in the community, and everything we do impacts us one way or another. If they say I can't vote on it because I'm going to be truncating my term, I can truncate my term anytime I want to resign. I mean, we do it all the time. Somebody gets selected, another body gets a job, has an illness, whatever it is. It's just, we need to put a little rational thought, a rationalization into this whole process. And to me, going to an election with the state is going to be fraught with problems, not just for the one election, but for elections perhaps beyond that. And so, we've got some things to do, but I think common sense on it.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Last comment, Mr. Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, Ms. Dombrowski, I do appreciate your perspective on this, and I think your solution is a rather elegant one, and would like to work on it with it.
I would love that, Mr. Flynn, if you'll help me.
Yeah. My recollection of the Board of Ethics finding was it did deal specifically with financial impacts by extending terms. You get another 7 months in office. We don't get paid much, but we get paid a little bit. Mr. Birch was part of PERS, so that improved his retirement situation a little bit more, and so on and so forth. I struggle to frame my mind in a way that allows me to think that shortening our terms could be a conflict, but the statutory framework that allows us to make a decision of necessity, I think, is appropriate, even if it's already authorized in state law. Just to clarify that we, as Mr. Steele said, we always have a conflict. Everything we do, I mean, some way, somehow, some method shapes what we have in front of us. We vote on liquor licenses. I'm the only member of this body who happens to own 2 of them, but another one coming into the network affects my business. Probably in a positive way, frankly. We all have jobs. Well, not always. You retiring guys. Anyway. But,
Mr. Flynn, can you wrap it up?
Yeah, just
Thank
so
you.
so I think your solution to the overall problem is a good one. I don't necessarily think this needs to wait for that, but I'll work on it with you.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Would the body like to have another work session on this subject? I think it might be a good idea, Mr. Hall.
Well, number one, we kind of lost the topic that we were on. We ended up on a separate topic that really wasn't part of the session, but I think it was an integral part. I will be asking to postpone this to the last meeting in July. We'll give the Ethics Commission a chance to resolve whatever they're doing with. So as far as I'm concerned, I think on this particular topic, I think we covered that.
Okay.
If we want to have a work session on conflicts and in regards to ethical, that may be an interesting one, but my own opinion is I think we've covered this one, and I will vote to postpone, and it will come back before us on the last meeting in July.
Thank you. With that said, thank you everyone for being here. Work session is ended.